Actually, the fact that we have 4 Gospels rather than just one increases our confidence in the story of the life of Jesus, his deeds, his words, and his resurrection. The fact that we have the perspective of 4 different authors who bring to expression things about the life of Jesus increases the vividness and the clarity of the detail we have about this historical person. Now, the message of Christ, the gospel, was being preached around the Mediterranean in the various cultures that were found there at the time, soon, very soon after his death and resurrection. And each of these gospels was being written to meet a need of a particular culture. For example, the gospel that most scholars think was the first gospel to be written, the Gospel of Mark, was written to the Romans. It is the recorded preaching of the Apostle Peter, so one of the inner circle of the 12 disciples of Jesus. It is not entirely certain which gospel was written first. Most scholars think that Mark was written first. However, some think it was Matthew. Mark was the preaching of the Apostle Peter, one of the 12 in the inner circle. The Gospel of Matthew was written by the Apostle Matthew, one of the 12, and it was written to satisfy the need to know by the Jews how Jesus fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament about the coming of the Messiah. Some people even think that Matthew was first written in Aramaic and then translated into Greek. Though this is possible, it's far from certain. The third gospel, the Gospel of Luke, was written by a close associate and fellow worker of the Apostle Paul. Luke is especially interesting because he actually gives us a description of how he went about his historical research. Let me read for you the verses at the beginning of the Gospel of Luke. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile an account of the things accomplished among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were from the beginning eyewitnesses and servants of the word, it seemed fitting for me as well, having investigated everything carefully from the beginning, to write it out for you in consecutive order, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the exact truth about the things you have been taught. So you see, Luke emphasized the thoroughness of his research and the care he took in writing his gospel. However, very early in the 20th century, a famous archaeologist and historical scientist who was skeptical of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts launched an extensive study into Luke's writings to see how many mistakes or how erroneous much of his writing might be. But the results of his research forced him to acknowledge just the opposite. Let me read for you what this man by the name of Sir William Ramsay said about the Gospel of Luke. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historian's, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. In fact, Ramsay went on to say, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. And Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. These conclusions were reached by a man who was actually a skeptic, who was not a Christian, and he did not believe in the historical reliability of Luke and his writing in the Gospel and the book of Acts. Yet his research forced him to just exactly the opposite conclusions, that Luke was in fact painstakingly careful and accurate in the picture that he gave of the history of Jesus and the apostles. Finally, the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, was written by one of the 12. In fact, John was in the inner circle of the three most significant disciples who were close to Jesus, Peter, James, and John. John wrote later than the other writers of Gospels did, but he wrote for a universal audience with a great deal that the other gospel writers hadn't included, which he knew by virtue of his closeness to Jesus, so that we have a greater insight into Jesus' teachings about himself and his relationship with God, the Father, than we get from any of the other three Gospels. So does it undermine or weaken our confidence in the truthfulness of our information about Jesus that we have four Gospels instead of one? Quite the contrary. The fact that we have four increases our confidence because these four writers complement one another, give details that each one don't include, but some of them do. They overlap at times, and consequently we have a fuller picture with more detail, and we have more confidence that the picture they paint for us, what we read in these Gospels, is an accurate picture of the greatest person ever to live in history. All the writings in the Bible, of course, were written by men. However, God does speak through men when he calls prophets to give his message. So the writings that we find in the Gospels are of this nature. They were the message of God to man through the immediate followers of Jesus, through the apostles and those who accompanied the apostles. This doesn't present any barriers to seeing these writings as having been inspired by God. Indeed, the fact that they each had a personal relationship with Christ, the historical Jesus, and wrote about him from their experience with him lends greater confidence to us that what they wrote is an accurate picture of this man who was, in fact, God in human flesh, the greatest person to ever live.